Today on The Science of Creativity, I'm interviewing Professor Danah Henriksen of Arizona State University. Dr. Henriksen is an expert on creativity and teaching. She's going to talk about what she calls the 7 habits of mind of exceptional creators. Her research shows that the most creative people engage in multiple different activities and disciplines. For example, a scientist who performs jazz piano. She's going to tell us how to use technology to enhance creativity. Stay tuned for today's interview with Dr. Danah Henriksen. Welcome to the Science of Creativity, your home for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. My mission is to inspire you with stories of brilliant creators and world-changing inventions. You'll learn about the latest psychological studies and gain insights about creativity that will help you reach your full creative potential. For today's episode, I'm very excited to be talking to Professor Danah Henriksen. She's a professor at Arizona State University. She's one of the top creativity researchers in the United States. She's going to share her insights on many important topics, including exceptional teaching, the role of technology in creativity and learning, how to use design thinking to enhance creativity. Dr. Henriksen studies creativity in education with a focus on creative teaching practices and skills. She studied national award-winning exceptional teachers to identify and describe their creative thinking and how they teach. She's an expert on design thinking, and that's a topic that's closely related to creativity research. Both areas involve creative problem solving, generating and refining ideas, and the constant balance between convergent and divergent thinking. Dr. Henriksen has identified the 7 habits of mind associated with exceptional teachers. Her research shows that exceptional creators, including teachers, engage in multiple areas or domains of creativity, and this practice helps them make connections. These are the connections that can lead to surprising new ideas. She calls this transdisciplinary thinking. Dr. Henriksen's research is influential, it's transformative, and I'm delighted to have her as a guest on The Science of Creativity. I'm here today with Dr. Danah Henriksen, who's a professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Henriksen and I are the co-authors of the book Explaining Creativity, The Science of Human Innovation, which was published by Oxford University Press in January. Danah is a top scientist. She's doing rigorous studies of creativity with well over 100 scientific journal articles, book chapters, academic presentations. I'm delighted to have her join me today. Danah, welcome to The Science of Creativity.
Thanks for having me, Keith. Thank you for that wonderful intro.
Well, I'd like to start by asking you to say a little bit about how you got interested in the science of creativity. I know you had a long career before you even started graduate school, so I'm curious, when did you decide to start the PhD program? How did you decide to study creativity for your research career?
Sure, and thanks for that question. It's an interesting one. I've had kind of a bit of a winding path. If you had asked me 20 plus years ago if I'd be studying creativity, or if I'd have a PhD and be a faculty member, a researcher, I would have been surprised because I did my bachelor's degree in marketing from Michigan State University at the business school. And I have to say, as an undergrad, I think I went with marketing. I thought a business degree would be the right thing to do because I was interested in so many things, but I didn't feel I had a singular passion. You know, in school, I liked science, but I also liked language arts. I liked a lot of different things. I was interested in many topics, but I didn't have sort of a single driving focus, like I'm going to be a biologist or I'm going to be a writer. In undergraduate, I was kind of thinking about, I think a business degree would be a good idea, but marketing was really the only one that interested me. And I think in retrospect, some of it is that sense of creativity, of how we think about presenting new things, new information. And I liked the sort of the psychology aspect behind it. What I didn't like, what I found when I got out of school, was the sort of corporate drive, the notion of like selling products, all of that. So I spent, a few years out of my bachelor's degree working in marketing and just was kind of looking for a change. I ended up getting a job working for Michigan State University in their outreach. At the time, that was almost 25 years ago. It was kind of a catch-all sort of little marketing position, a marketing assistant position where they needed some administrative support. I really just wanted to be working in education. I felt like it would be a nice change from corporate. So there were some marketing aspects to it, but it was also, it was the early days of online courses and online teaching, and that outreach division was also supporting some of the very first online courses ever that Michigan State University was doing. So I got to do a lot of things that I probably wouldn't get to do now, that there are much more specialized careers and instructional designers and ed tech people that would be doing it. But at the time, I was just kind of helping out with a lot of that work and was finding that I was really fascinated by education. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I thought, I'm working for MSU. I'm going to start taking some classes and just explore. I took a class in nutrition. I took an art class, and I actually kind of wandered into an education class, a class in educational technology that had a real focus on design and design thinking and design schemas as a way of framing education. So that really caught my interest, and I realized that was sort of the missing piece for me, thinking about the world in terms of a design lens. I think marketing had just been kind of a grabbing onto something that seemed interesting and practical, but starting to take coursework at a graduate level, I just became much more interested in that view of education and sort of the scholarly ways of thinking. It really grabbed my attention. So I did my master's in educational technology through Michigan State all the time I was working there in the outreach division, still doing some online learning and marketing work with them. Then I enjoyed it so much. I really enjoyed graduate school and research and all of those elements that I went on and did my PhD. When I first started my doctorate program in educational psychology and educational technology, I really thought that I would be sort of keeping with that focus on design and design thinking. But just as things evolved, I realized, you sort of explore your interests through the process of doing a doctorate. And the thing that I kept coming back to was creativity. I was reading a lot of work in that area. I was realizing that it coincided well with my interest in design, but it really coincided with an interest that I've always had in how people who are really good at what they do, people who are really innovative, people who are excellent, people who excel at their craft of work, how they think and what they do. So I read some studies by Robert and Michelle Root-Bernstein on creativity in top scientists, and I started to get interested in what that might look like for teachers and students in classrooms. So that kind of led into my dissertation study of creativity. And from there, my career has just unfolded. I've always kind of followed my interest as they came along, and creativity has been sort of the perfect thread to follow for that, because it is such a wide and varied and diverse area that really touches on all aspects of human life and thinking and work and what we do. So me kind of starting out as someone who was a bit of a dabbler, interested in a lot of things, studying creativity over the years has allowed me to explore many different topical intersections, including design and design thinking, where I started, including other interests that have popped up along the way, mindfulness and well-being, technology, STEM and the arts. A lot of different things connect with creativity and education. So my narrative as a scholar has really been focused on the sort of broad interest in all areas of creativity and education, and that has allowed me to kind of play in many different sandboxes. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but it was sort of a wandering path, but I'm very happy with the way that it's gone. I couldn't imagine wanting to study anything else at this point.
Oh, that is fascinating. Yes, thank you for telling that story. And looking at your curriculum vitae, I see that you got your master's degree in 2003. So you were talking about working on educational technology before that, online courses as long ago as maybe
Yeah.
2000. Yeah, you
Yes.
were way ahead of
Right
the curve
around then.
there.
It was funny because it's looking back at it, it almost seems funny. And I paused a little as I was describing it, because now working for ASU, we have an entire division of hundreds of people who instructional designers, and we have a whole unit, a giant building called Ed Plus devoted to online learning and many different experts with that. And I was just sort of out of, that was around the year 2000, right out of a bachelor's, and people were just starting to play with what would this look like, an online course. And the outreach division did a lot of professional development for people around the state of Michigan. So they were kind of playing with that idea of online courses. And so I was using Dreamweaver. A lot of people listening to this might not remember what Dreamweaver was, but it was a
I
software that allowed
remember.
you, yeah, and you actually had to figure out how to code things and how to FTP things to the server, things that, it's a dinosaur, a lot of those aspects these days, but but it gave me an interesting entry point into the field. And I think so then when online teaching started to spread more in the mid 2000s, and I was at that point getting into doing my doctorate, I had a little bit of familiarity with it, and I got to be a teaching assistant in a lot of those courses. And I didn't have the reticence about teaching some of those online courses that I think a lot of faculty who had always taught face to face had. I just kind of jumped in and assumed, of course, people can learn online. That will be, why not? So over the years, then I actually started with more online teaching than face to face teaching, and I've had opportunities to teach hybrid models, face to face models, online models, and they all have their affordances and constraints. But I don't usually reflect on it in this way, but oh, that's kind of an interesting starting point. The year 2000.
Well, your current home of Arizona State University, of course, is legendary for their innovation in online education, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, that's a big part of the ASU focus, and I think that comes from our president Michael Crow's interest in the idea of our charter being that we include more people. We take pride in including more people than we exclude, and part of education and that spread of education and being inclusive is the idea that it can't just be local. There's still obviously a strong local presence. We have 4 large campuses around the Phoenix area and a lot of online classes. But in order to kind of have that global outreach, it meant putting a big stake in the sand for online teaching. And so after being at MSU and doing my PhD there and then doing a postdoc for a couple of years, I came here to ASU in 2015, and they were starting the first fully online doctoral program and EDD program that I still teach and work in. But it was the first time of trying to do it fully online. And I think having had the opportunity to have a lot of online teaching and learning experience at MSU, that was sort of an entry point for me to come here to ASU and help in the design and setup and running of that program that started small. And we now have at any given time several hundred students in it. ASU overall just has a very sort of big mechanism behind the online coursework and the global outreach, and yeah, trying to be inclusive about opportunities for everybody to do a degree.
Well, I was intrigued by your connection between exceptional scientists. You said you've been reading work by the Ruth
Yeah,
Bernsteins about exceptional scientists, and then
yes.
you decided to study exceptional teachers, and that became your doctoral dissertation in 2011. So, yeah,
Yes.
say a little bit about that. What do you think are the characteristics of exceptional teachers?
Sure. So I had, as I was interested in, like I said, kind of the craft of work and creativity and excellence, I was doing some reading by Robert and Michelle Root Bernstein. Robert Root Bernstein is a MacArthur Genius Scholar at Michigan State University, and he had done some studies, particularly back in the 90s, of highly creative scientists, and was very interested in transdisciplinary creativity, or this idea that creativity spans the disciplines. And if you're creative in one field or area, probably likely to have the ability to transpose your ideas across fields and to be kind of cross pollinating ideas. So he studied creativity among a wide group of scientists, and everything from sort of everyday working scientists on up to Nobel laureates who were also part of some of his studies. And what he found was that scientific innovation has a strong correlation with among scientists with people who also have interest in fields like art and music and photography and a wide range of areas. So we tend to think of the sciences as this kind of cold and rigid, scientists are quite methodical and the scientific process is quite linear. But actually, in studying the most exceptional scientists, they had a much wider array of interest, and not only had those interests, but they also actively talked about how, for example, if they were, say, accomplished in radiology, that having artistic hobbies or interests had maybe sparked some of their innovations and ideas. That creativity in the sciences is quite associated with transdisciplinary thinking or being creative across disciplines. In the case of the scientists that he studied, it wasn't necessarily that the Nobel laureates were also great accomplished artists, but simply that they had those interests and they were quite diverse in what they dabbled in, and that they actively used those ideas to seed their own professional creativity. So that just got me interested in what excellence and creativity in teaching might look like, especially having seen sort of the era of No Child Left Behind, where a lot of it feels like a lot of the creativity in teaching has been stamped out, and that in general, education systems tend to be quite behaviorist and not really allow for a lot of creative exploration by teachers and students. But there's a lot of interesting areas where that's not the case, where we do find these pockets of innovation and teachers being creative and doing things that where they think outside of the box and they're not necessarily sticking to the rigid standardized curriculum. So I interviewed really accomplished teachers. I didn't really know what the teaching equivalent of a Nobel laureate would be, but I thought National Teacher of the Year award winners in the United States would be an interesting place to start. So I did a small study, a very in-depth qualitative study of National Teacher of the Year award winners and finalists. They were teachers from many different fields. Some were elementary teachers. There were, high school teachers, middle school teachers, some teaching strictly in science or strictly in language arts. And like I said, some of the elementary teachers teaching obviously across the different elementary disciplines. And what I found was sort of the same pattern happening, where these teachers were highly creative people in that, for example, this is just one example, but it played out across the whole sample. A middle school science teacher that I spoke to, who had been National Teacher of the Year award winner, who had a background and a degree in forestry and had gone into the profession of teaching. And so was very embedded in the sciences, did all this wildly creative, interesting work with his students and had been getting wonderful results, even on some of the standardized test measures that he wasn't necessarily trying to teach to, but his students were so engaged. They were doing some arts-based learning in the sciences and also just very interdisciplinary kinds of work. And that played out across all of them. Language arts teachers bringing, doing things with music and bringing that in and kind of seeing the connections across the disciplines. So I think some of the things that I found that were characteristic of really creative teachers, I would say there were a lot of themes. It's a dissertation study, so there's a lot to unpack there. But for example, some of the key themes: real world learning. So really trying to embed learning within real world settings. If you're teaching science, then how can we get out of the classroom and maybe have students go down to the school cafeteria and do food toxicology and food safety studies down there and explore that in their own backyard, their own cafeteria, or maybe looking at the social dimensions of science in the world where they do, environmental local cleanup activities, or a town hall activity where certain students are playing different stakeholders in environmental issues, politicians, lobbyists, environmental activists, and kind of debating and creating a town hall based around the issue. So they were doing all these kinds of real world learning and also interdisciplinary, which kind of goes along with that. Anything that you do with real world connections has some inherent interdisciplinarity. But these teachers were actively looking to cross-pollinate the disciplines. If they're teaching math, how can I bring in music? And one of the teachers was he's also known as the rap and mathematician. So he created all this rap music based on algebra for his students and had his students creating their own rap music to algebra ideas and concepts and kind of connecting the idea of beats and movements in math to movements in music. That sort of thing, it was amazing to talk to these teachers and see the different ways that they were playing with those ideas. And the notion of intellectual risk taking, I think, was another key point, was that they were willing to try new things, kind of had this openness to experience. We know in creativity studies that openness to experience is one of the personality traits most correlated with creativity, most reliably. And so it was kind of no surprise, I guess, to find that they just had this creative open mindset of, well, let's just try it. Let's try something new. I know the standard, or I'm sorry, I know that the test coming up is focused on these things and I have this kind of scripted curriculum, but how can I work with that and still kind of break out of it and dabble and try new things? So those were, a few key ideas. There's a lot more that goes with that. I also studied transdisciplinary thinking skills amongst these teachers, which are these broad creative habits of mind that seem to be as relevant in the sciences as they are in the arts, as they are in language or in other fields. Things like thinking about patterns, abstract thinking, close observational skills. There's this whole set of skills that go along with transdisciplinary creativity. And I also kind of did a mini study of that with these teachers and saw the ways that whatever discipline they were teaching, whatever context they were teaching in, they all seem to have these, they hadn't necessarily put a term to it like abstraction or I'm thinking about patterns here, but you could see those kinds of thinking skills playing out quite clearly in the ways that they were thinking about their teaching practice and the ways that they were designing lessons and learning experiences, and also in the kinds of skills that they wanted to support in their own students, and looking for their own students to become creative people and support creative habits of mind for the students in their care.
Oh, it is fascinating. And I think I get the connection, right, between these exceptional scientists who are people who are not only scientists, but they are accomplished at some level in something else like music or painting or gardening.
Yes.
Now you're seeing that these exceptional teachers teach in ways that bring together different ways of thinking or different disciplines. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And also, that's a good point you made about the original study. So they teach in those ways, but those teachers also had a wide range of personal creative interests that they also kind of actively drew upon. So all of them had, or I think there was let's see, I had a sample of about 10, 8 or 9 of them had interest in the arts. One played the violin, one did a lot of visual arts and photography. Each of them had kind of their own unique interest, but I think one was also in dance. There's kind of this wide range of hobbies and personal creativity interests that they engaged in and dabbled in that they seemed to kind of draw upon. And when asked about that, they actively made connections to the ways of thinking that they used in their personal creativity and how that helped to seed their professional creativity. So in that sense, it kind of drew upon, and I didn't know that going into it. I knew that the Root Bernsteins had found this interesting connection among creative scientists, but to explore that with teachers and find that same pattern playing out, they also had a wide range of topical subject matter interests that they explored, and that they were doing that kind of actively cross-pollinating ideas, both in the sense of drawing upon them for their kind of approaches to teaching, but also actively instantiating that in lesson plans. And again, going back to the scientists, it wasn't that they were the best. Like I said, one teacher played violin. It wasn't that she was necessarily an accomplished violinist or the best violinist out there, but having those interests and just actively giving time to that seemed to be something that she and that all of them really used to fuel their own professional creativity. So it's not that creative people necessarily have to be the best or the most stellar across every particular subject matter or interest. They had sort of, each of them had a focus in an area that they excelled in their teaching, but that outside of their teaching, they have these different interests, and that kind of helped fuel them as a creative person.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important things to creativity is sometimes I'll say that you should just be a dilettante or
Yes.
even what I might jokingly call a professional dilettante, that you intentionally go out and learn how to do some of these other things. And you're right, you don't have to be accomplished, you don't have to be world famous, but it's just the intention of getting your mind to work in a different sort of way, in a different endeavor.
Yes, exactly. And it gives you inspiration to draw on. I think having a wide range of experiences, creative experiences, hobbies, habits, things that you do, even things like, we know things like multicultural experiences or travel often help seed creativity. And I think I don't know if there's been research on this, but my guess is that goes to several points. One is that openness to experience, that having a lot of different experiences helps open you up and see beyond your sort of natural constraints of your own perspective. And then it helps fuel inspiration because you're able to draw on ideas from different areas and kind of make connections and find transfer points. So if I am, say, a medical radiologist and I have habits or hobbies in the visual arts, maybe there's ideas and ways of seeing things differently that might lead to some innovation or some unique accomplishments in my field. And I brought that example up because I think it's been a few years, more than a few years since I've read the Root Bernstein study, but I think that was one of the examples that there was an accomplished scientist who had made some really interesting innovations in the field of radiology who happened to mention that just dabbling and playing with the visual arts gave him a different lens or a different way of seeing things that sparked some ideas within his profession. So that idea of cross-pollinating ideas is really important, and just, yeah, being open and having a lot to draw on. So, and I think anybody can do that. We tend to think of creativity as just for the very gifted or for uniquely creative people, but everybody can kind of open themselves up a little bit and dabble and have new experiences that can make you more creative.
Oh, absolutely. We all have a lot to learn from these exceptional scientists and these teachers that you interviewed. And a few minutes ago, you mentioned these transdisciplinary habits of mind, seven, right? Because your
Yeah,
2017 book with Springer, it's called The Seven Transdisciplinary Habits of Mind for Creative
yeah.
Education. So could you say something about maybe one or two of these habits of mind that all the rest of us could use on a daily basis to enhance our creativity?
Sure. So those originally stemmed from, again, the Root Bernstein's work. They have a book called Sparks of Genius where they lay out 13 transdisciplinary habits of mind. And honestly, just trying to kind of come up with a skill set that we could think about in education, 13 seemed like too many. So earlier in my career with some of my colleagues, we kind of broke that down and condensed it, taking their skill set and combining some of them that made sense together, and we came up with a set of seven, which includes observation. So, having very close observational skills and being able to really hone in on and see what's there and notice things is one. Pattern thinking, being able to both recognize patterns that exist in the world and create new ones. Abstract thinking, the idea of being able to kind of see beyond all the details and the surface and abstract something down to the most fundamental essence. So we see that in, really creative, abstract modern artists like Picasso is obviously a famous example of abstraction, where they're not being really literal, but thinking about the essence of something and pulling that out. But scientists practice abstraction too if they're doing an experiment and need to kind of hone in on one element of or feature that they're looking at. They might exclude a bunch of other factors like mass and boiling point and just kind of think about what I need to focus in on here. Embodied thinking is another key one, which really is that notion of kinesthetic thinking or thinking with the body. In addition, we kind of included the skill of empathy in that, in a way of sort of experiencing things physically in the body, both through empathy and through that actual kinesthetic way of thinking. Modeling is another one. That one, people across all professions make models. Architects do models, scientists do models, artists create models. So that ability to represent things, represent real world phenomena or something that you're working with in a way that is not the thing itself. So creating a representation, a blueprint, a map, a diagram, something that is an alternate representation is really important for creative work and creative thinking. Play is another skill that was, let's see, I think that's the sixth one. So when we talk about play, even though I think playground play is really important for kids in schools, as a transdisciplinary school, we're not really thinking of play so much in that way. It's more the idea of intellectual play, playing around with ideas, kind of pushing the boundaries. I have a few examples I could share of that one. And then finally, the skill of synthesis, which is kind of this higher level ability to put it all together. So combining different elements, synthesizing information, kind of using multiple of these skills and putting it all together. So synthesis is kind of where it all comes together in a creative product. So those are the skills themselves. A lot of different ways that that plays out. Like in abstraction, that could come about, teachers using the simplest way is kind of using metaphors or analogies or things that help to capture the fundamental essence of something without it being the thing itself. Let me see if I can think of others. Play is really important. So a lot of times in education, it comes around to, we think of play as like this thing that's distinct from learning. Kids are doing their learning and then they go out in the playground or they leave school and that's when they get to play. But actually embedding some play in some of the work that students do in the classroom, giving them time to kind of play around with ideas a little bit and think about what it looks like. And that's something that some of these teachers structured in different ways, but it was an interesting thing where they kind of talked about that. If we're doing an experiment, I'm going to give them a little bit of time to play with the materials and tell me what they're noticing and what they're thinking about and explore a little bit and play with ideas before we actually start the more process oriented teaching and learning. All of those can be seen in examples from great scientists, great artists, but you can also see interesting ways that creative teachers kind of employ these skills. And I find it useful to have this set of seven skills because sometimes creativity feels like such an open, unbounded, and intimidating space to a lot of people. A lot of people are really hesitant to self identify as creative. A lot of teachers that I've run into will say, I'm not very creative. I'd like to be more creative. And I think most people actually do have a lot more creativity than they give themselves credit for, but it can be such a kind of open and intimidating word to use. Creative, we have these big aspirations for creativity. And I think having something like a skill set that you can focus on it sort of helps break it down and for teachers think about specific things they can do. Like, how can I incorporate a little bit more pattern thinking into this lesson? How can I do some modeling? If I'm having students learn about geometry, can they make a model of, like, I think one teacher said, oh, I had them make like a model of a dream house and actually do some of the drawing up of plans and architecture and thinking about some of the geometry of it. And that idea of a model can be integrated. That's where the 7 skills come in. They are kind of broadly useful in different ways to creative thinking and to teaching as well.
I love this idea of mindsets or habits of mind, and the 7 you're describing. As I'm listening, to me, it sounds like, I don't know, I guess you could say the underlying architecture of human cognition. It's just
Yes.
the way the mind is organized, and all of us have this ability to think in terms of patterns or to use metaphors. It's the way the mind works. And I guess you
Yes.
would say these exceptional individuals somehow have intentionally built up these mindsets or abilities that we all have inside us, so we could all learn how to do these things at a higher level, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. That's a good way to think about it. These 7 skills are kind of part of creative cognition, but part of cognition overall. And if you think about creativity, it's not one thing, it's not one skill. We often talk about divergent thinking and convergent thinking, and there's many different aspects to creativity. Even when you talk to neuroscientists, they can never pinpoint it in one place in the brain because it's kind of there's different skills and different ways of thinking that are being pulled into it. And these 7 skills, it's not to say that it's the absolute, it's a model in and of itself, I guess you could say in that way. It's not the absolute or the only representation of creative thinking, but I find it to be kind of a useful one because, like you said, it captures a lot of higher order thinking, which is what creativity is. Gives you kind of some skills, some habits of mind to take note of and to focus on as you're refining your creative work. And when you break down and look at the work of creative people, you can find different elements of those thinking skills that play out in how they think and in the actual products that they create.
Well, I think 7 is a really good number. 13,
Miller's rule.
13, 13 is a lot. Yes, and
13
I've read
so.
that. I've read that Ruth Bernstein book, Sparks of Genius, which is such a seminal book in creativity research.
Yes.
But 7 is good. And of course, in the book that we did together, Explaining Creativity, we have eight stages or 8 habits of mind. And those are the
Yes.
same 8 that I have in my book called Zigzag, the 8. I think of them as mindsets or habits of mind, not so
Yeah.
much as stages of a process that you go through linearly, but these 7 habits of mind you can use at the same time, or you can use them in any order, any sequence, right? It's not a
Right.
matter of stages, they're just ways that you approach the world.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I'm not in terms of process models, I think they're oftentimes much more linear and messy and meta than we give them credit for. So I tend to think that thinking of things in terms of habits of mind or skills or capabilities is a useful way of doing it. So yeah, that's how I think of it as well. And that's kind of similar to design thinking. There's these different design thinking skills and process models out there which are useful, but I think if you were to really look at them, the way people practice design thinking or explore design, it's not this sort of, well, first I do this and then I do this and then I ideate and then I make a prototype. It's oftentimes much more messy than that. And you could associate any sort of process model for design thinking with actual cognitive skills for ideation or for empathizing or for any of these elements in the process.
Oh, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. A few minutes ago, you mentioned design thinking and that it was a part of what you were doing all the way back. I think you said even before your master's degree in educational technology, that this was just a part of what you did. So, yeah, how would you
Yeah.
characterize design thinking? That's been very influential in business and innovation
Yeah.
management.
Yeah, it has sort of taken hold in a lot of areas of innovation, like you said, corporate management, but also in education, this idea of design thinking as cognitive skills or processes that designers use across different fields as they're designing something, as they're designing solutions, designing products. So you can look across the field of design and even outside of design to find these different process models, we often call them, for design. So the one that most people are probably familiar with is IDEO's design thinking model from the Stanford Design School, which is a sort of a 5-stage model where there's empathizing, then there's defining a problem, then there's ideating or brainstorming, then you make a prototype of the solution or what you're creating, and then there's testing it. And there's many different models which all kind of have different elements of the same types of things. The models, I think, can be sort of helpful for people to think about what it might look like, but in reality, it's oftentimes much messier than that. And I think of those models not so much as phases or steps or stages, but similar to what you were saying before about creativity as kind of skills or capabilities that are useful when you're practicing design work. So I work with some colleagues in our design school, and they often think about design thinking not in terms of these processes so much as skills, capabilities, orientations to the world and to thinking and to problem solving that they engage in. For example, in something like the IDEO model, they start out with empathizing, where you actually really try to, like a designer does, practice empathy as a cognitive skill, where you think about the experience of the user or your audience or whoever you're designing for and try to understand their needs and try to get out of your own expectations and your own head a little bit and understand what would be useful as you go through the design process, and then you define the problem, and then you brainstorm around ideas. In reality, it's a lot more, like I said, kind of messy than that. When you're actually going through a design process, you might start by attempting to define the problem and then realize that after you go through and learn more and talk with users and empathize, that you have to go back and rework it, or maybe you've been given a problem to work on where there's already a bunch of ideas and brainstorming that's happened and you need to think about that, but then also go study the experience of users and practice empathy. So in reality, I think design thinking is much more about the cognitive skills or habits of mind that go into good design and that good designers use, those kind of meta level capabilities to practice empathy as a cognitive skill, not as just this kind of synonymous with sympathy felt experience, but more about really trying to understand and put yourself in someone's perspective. So there's empathy, being good at finding problems is really critical in design, brainstorming, ideation, coming up with ideas, all of these different skills. You can find them in most of the process models out there, and they've been put together a little bit differently in each one. Models are just a representation of the world, of reality, and there's different ways you can represent them. But when you kind of boil it down, I think a lot of design connects really well to creative problem solving when you think about it. It's an intentional seeking of solutions and trying to create and design things that help meet needs. So it's a little different from artistic creativity in that sense, but it is still a very creative process. So I've done some work. I haven't had an opportunity in the last few years to do as much with the design thinking work, but I was really doing a lot of it 5 or 6 years ago. I had created a course at MSU built around design thinking for teachers that went really well. I really enjoyed teaching it and got a lot of really good feedback from the students. So we had a lot of data from that course. And so I have some studies on the use of design thinking with teachers. But I really found that even though we think a lot of these quote unquote design skills are obvious or are things that we would innately do, like teachers in particular tend to be very empathetic people. So you would think like, oh, I can do empathy. I'm great at it. But when you actually start applying it in a really thoughtful, rigorous way in the way that a designer does, they got all kinds of interesting insights about problems that they faced in their classroom or in their curriculum design. And they were able to we used the Stanford IDEO model in that course experience, just in order to have a process model to give to novices or people who hadn't done much with design thinking before. And it was really useful to have these habits of mind, ways of thinking that teachers aren't often explicitly trained in, that they could use to come up with some really interesting innovations and solutions in their classroom. And they really did. It was pretty cool. We had about 30 students in the class, and most of them were practicing teachers. They each started from some sort of a problem of practice that they wanted to work on and worked through a design thinking process to try to come up with something new. Might be a new unit, might be a solution to a big challenge in their classroom. Just had some really fun experiences with that, and a lot of feedback from the teachers saying they felt creative for the first time, which was interesting to me because the way Stanford presents it is such a linear model. But I think having that kind of a model can be sort of freeing to people who are intimidated by and nervous about creativity, where they were able to kind of use that as a process to kind of look to when they were uncertain or facing some of the open-endedness to kind of guide them along the way as they were creating things. I find design to be just really a useful kind of frame for thinking about problems and how to approach them.
Right. Well, I think so too. I think the best teachers are designers, right? Or certainly the
Yeah,
most creative teachers are designers because, maybe when you're just starting out as a teacher, you have a textbook, right? That you're structuring your
right,
course around. In some cases, it's a mandated curriculum from your district or your state, and you have the textbook. And then you teach straight through the textbook from the beginning of the semester to the end. And maybe
right.
that's not so creative, but I think the best teachers, they don't do that. They don't just go linearly through the textbook, but they actually will intentionally design classroom experiences for
Mhm.
their learners that are their own creative products, right? It's the artistry of teaching.
Yeah, I think we don't often give enough credence to teachers in terms of that aspect of their work. That just exact, I couldn't agree more. Exactly what you said, that teachers are designers. And I've often framed it that way in my work, that teachers are designers. Teaching is a work of design. You're designing experiences, you're designing solutions to problems that your students encounter, you're designing a classroom environment, you're designing practices, and it's never going to look the same. There's no one clear solution for every teacher. We may give them all the same curriculum, but it's going to have to look very different based on the unique context and the unique students that they're in and all the variations that we see out in the real world. So, sort of emboldening that creativity is, I think, really critical because teachers already have that or are doing that. It's just something that we haven't necessarily explicitly focused on as much in teacher education. I sort of started from some of the ideas by Herbert Simon, who was a Nobel laureate, who kind of was one of the originators of the scientific study of design, and he had a much more sort of scientific lens on design than I take. But he has a really interesting quote about the fact that anyone who is essentially, I don't have the quote right in front of me, I wish that I did, anyone who is designing solutions to problems, anyone who's seeking to take an existing situation and move it towards an ideal or a better or an improved situation is a designer. So you can see that in a lot of fields where people are, if they're doing it at a relatively high level, they're engaging some design skills. That is part of teaching, but so often policy and curricula and standardized testing has kind of drilled some of that out for a lot of teachers. So giving them the awareness that they are designers and that the work that they're doing is creative design work is a really critical move to make in supporting that kind of creative teaching.
Well, you're doing such important work, especially it sounds like you're giving these teachers permission, perhaps, to be creative. So they already are creative, but maybe they need that permission. You were saying that the design thinking model with its 5 steps, it might seem a little bit too highly articulated or maybe too
Hmm.
structured. But when someone sees this for the first time, it emboldens them, was the word you used, right?
Yeah,
They could
yeah,
say, "Oh, yeah, I see what that is. I know how to do those 5 things, and
yeah.
this is what people are doing at Stanford. It's what people are doing in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, so why can't I do that in my classroom?" Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so something like the IDEO model with this sort of empathize and then define and then ideate, and then it is linear and there's critiques, good critiques of it for that reason. It's not something that would make sense for, a design expert to go sit there and like, I'm going to start with empathize. More expert or more experienced designer has a more messy and intuitive sense of these, and they do play out much more like skills that they figure out how to utilize. But for a novice or someone who doesn't have that intentional design lens, it's really incredibly helpful to think about how you can start into a problem solving process, especially for a big problem or an issue that you're working on or something that you want to create or design for your classroom. In that sense, the way that it starts with empathy is incredibly powerful. Like I was saying, people who are naturally empathetic, teachers, they care for their students, they want to help them. They can go into it feeling like I already understand what the problem is, I already understand what my students need. But when you actually have to engage it in kind of a more structured way as a beginner into design thinking, that was actually incredibly powerful. There were, as part of the coursework, they had to start with going out and maybe interviewing some of their students, putting themselves in that position, doing some observations. And so many of them came back and said, whoa, I thought I knew what my students were thinking. I had no idea what they were thinking. So that more intentional engagement of empathy in a kind of borderline empirical way that design thinking does is really helpful. And again, having that kind of a structured model, even though it doesn't necessarily represent the messiness of actual practice. And even though these teachers themselves probably, as they were going through the class, were engaging different design skills in different places in the quote unquote process, it is helpful to have that, especially as you're trying to learn about it and how to kind of go through it. I think, we chose the IDEO one because it's popular. I really like that it starts with empathy and a really intentional exploration of that, because so often we come into problems with a frame already set up in our head and thinking that we understand it. And trying to understand the problem from somebody else's perspective can really help you break frame and kind of shake up your expectations a little bit. Like I said, it wouldn't make sense for, some of my design colleagues to go and start into a process by like, here's the Stanford model and I'm going to do these things. They can engage with it in a different way. But I am a big fan of having a process model when you're working with people who are new to these kinds of things and haven't necessarily been thinking of themselves as a designer, or who have been feeling a little bit de-skilled by the way that teaching is often viewed in the US today.
One of the things I think is particularly valuable from this design thinking mindset is traditionally when people think about design, they're thinking about designing a product, like it's a new fork or it's a new blender for your
Yeah.
kitchen. But there's been this shift to, instead of thinking about designing a product, that you're designing an experience. You're
Yeah.
designing an experience for some user. And to be successful at that, you have to understand that user better, right? It's that empathy. So you start out by going out there and talking to people, which surprisingly is something a lot of people haven't thought of
Right.
doing, right? But
Right.
once you hear it, you go talk to people and they tell you things that you were not expecting and you realize you were making assumptions. So it's that the value of hearing something from someone outside of yourself. You're designing an experience for them. So then when you get into the classroom, I guess you could think of your students, I guess, as quote unquote the users, or
Yes.
you're certainly as a teacher designing an experience.
Yeah.
The classroom is an experience, whether it's a good one or a bad one.
Yeah.
So, and even if maybe you don't realize you're designing an experience, you're just teaching from the textbook, but it's still going to be an experience. So, your mission, I guess, as a teacher is to be intentional about how you design that experience for the student in such a way, and this is your research, in such a way that it might foster creativity in those students, right?
Yeah, I think that is something that we all kind of live in our own head and our own perspective, and we enter into any question or problem already with some ideas programmed in. It's almost unavoidable. That's one of the challenges when you're kind of doing creative work, is to break frame. When you get stuck in design, there's this idea of design fixation where people already have kind of clung on to an idea or a solution or a view of the problem, and they have a hard time seeing alternatives. But empathy or empathetic research, which we actually tried to, at least in teaching this class, engage empathy as a kind of research, a user-centered research. And you're right. And we use the terminology user because that's what design uses and that's what's part of these process models. But it's essentially talking about your students or your stakeholders, or if you're trying to design, a program for parents in your school, they're your user. Your user is the person you're creating for. But we tend to assume, and it's just natural to come in with our own frame of the world and assume that we understand what's going on and that I have this idea and it's a good idea and that's what I'm going to do. We know from creativity research, right, that perspective taking and the ability to try on different ideas and perspectives and lenses and views of the world is really critical. So I think that's one of the ways that becomes really powerful. You can call it empathy, you can call it perspective taking, but actively trying to engage that, put aside your own initial perceptions and try to understand what's going on from somebody else's view can really shake up your understanding of something. Like you said, in design, we tend to think of like designing products, designing a toaster, designing a utensil, but design is much broader than that. That is part of it. Product design, there's graphic design, there's industrial design, but oftentimes it's about, in some way, shape, or form, designing a solution. There's the example of a hospital who can't understand why patients are having such a poor experience, why they get such poor feedback on why it's miserable to be there. And if you were to have a team of designers come in and explore that and come up with solutions, well, if they really explored it from the perspective of the user, they might find that the patient just comes in and is just laying in a bed for hours looking up at a blank white ceiling and trying to design a more engaging experience where they're having more interaction with the nurses or the staff, or where there's more color in the room or more light or more element, whatever they can do to kind of change that experience as part of the design thing. So sometimes design involves designing an actual product, a chair or something that, again, solves a problem or meets a need. But a lot of times it's about trying to solve a problem or improve something or create an experience. And so for teachers, it's very much focused on that idea of creating an experience. You can think of it some ways as a product if you're creating a lesson or creating a unit or something like that, or making something for your classroom. There can be this overlap between experience and product, but ultimately, I think design is intentional and purposeful and goal oriented. And there's something that you're trying to do or accomplish at the end of the process and in creating something. So that's where it becomes kind of a creative process of problem solving.
Well, you've been studying this for a long time, and as you were talking, I was just thinking back to the beginning of your career, all the way back maybe 2000, in the mid 2000s, and your involvement with technology. So in the past, 4 years after COVID, many of us have had this experience with educational technology.
Hmm.
Many students were in Zoom rooms learning. They all perhaps were using a learning management system. And I think most of us have had a not so pleasant experience with
Yeah.
technology in education. Not a lot of us, most of us have not had the experience of technology enhancing our creativity in a learning setting, right? If you're sitting in Zoom and the
Hmm.
teacher is lecturing into the Zoom camera, that isn't enhancing your creativity. But I
Right.
know a lot of your research has focused on the role technology can play in enhancing creativity. So, how can we get out of that kind of use of technology, which is not enhancing creativity, and somehow leverage these awesome new technologies in ways that might actually contribute to effective learning or even creative learning? What do you think the role of technology can be?
I think it involves thinking more about what you want to do with it. Again, if we think about it in terms of whether it's teaching or something that you're trying to create or make with the technology, what is it that you want to do? What is it that you want to accomplish? What's your goal? If you're designing a class experience, what kind of experience do you want students to have, and what kind of elements do you need to weave in and intentionally create into the process? And then how can the technology help you do it? How can you work with the affordances of the tool, the characteristics that allow you to do different things? How can you work around the constraints of the tool in order to accomplish that? All technologies have these affordances and constraints, and being able to kind of acknowledge those and figure out how you're going to use it to achieve a goal is really valuable. I think a lot of times, and especially with COVID, people who hadn't had as much opportunity to teach online tended to simply assume that the experience as mediated by the technology would be the same as what they did in face-to-face teaching, or that they should simply take their face-to-face teaching and try to do this one-to-one mapping, where if I teach a class in a certain way in a physical classroom, we'll just get on Zoom and try to do the same thing. And it doesn't work that way, because Zoom has different affordances and constraints as a physical classroom does. Being a little bit intentional, what technology is, it's just a tool, right? It's a cognitive tool that allows us to do different things than what we would do if we were just sitting there without the tool. So I often think about technologies in that way. We often think of technology as just strictly the digital world, because that's technology. At one time, a box of crayons was a new technology. At one time, the pencil was a new technology, because these are tools that allow you to kind of break the boundaries of what you could do if you didn't have them. In the case of a pencil, if you have thoughts in your head, you can say them to someone, but now with the pencil, I can write them down and capture them. And there's a permanence, or at least a little bit more of a concreteness to them now that they're captured outside of my head. And every technology has those different things that it allows you to do with it and ways that you can work with it. And so just being thoughtful about not assuming you can do things the same way that you've always done them with a new tool. So an example right now, we're doing this podcast and we have this Zencaster technology that we're using to do this. If we didn't have the internet as a technology and Zencaster and all of the other things that go into making this kind of an experience, this conversation that we're having wouldn't be possible. And after we finish the conversation, we'll stop recording and you'll take the technology and the audio tools that you have and you'll add music and edit and do all of these creative things to ultimately create a finished product. The technology has these great benefits to expand beyond things that would be possible without them. We could have all of that, and yet if we just kind of sat here and had a really dry conversation, and if you didn't know how to edit or do any editing later, I've listened to your past podcasts and they're very creative and thoughtfully done and well crafted. But if all of that sort of crafting and thinking, intentional design didn't go into them, with the exact same technology, we could create something that just wasn't very creative or wasn't very interesting to people. It's not so much about the technologies themselves as much as kind of what they can do and what we bring to the process. Like I said, you're having this really good conversation and you have all these technology skills, so you'll create, a unique podcast experience at the end of it that can be put out there in the world for people to consume it. That's reliant on the tool, but if we didn't use the tool well, you could also create something that wasn't very creative. And the same goes with Zoom or any other digital technology. I think not just assuming that the technology will do it for you, not just assuming that you can jump on Zoom with your students and start talking and that it'll all be great. You have to put some thought into it. Like, how am I going to use the breakout rooms? How am I going to structure the lesson? What can we do differently if we're all on Zoom that we couldn't do if we're in a physical classroom? Do we want students to engage their own space and do a lesson or an experiment that involves them doing something in their home while they're on Zoom? So there's all kinds of things that go into that are beyond the technology. And I think just keeping in mind that doesn't mean that, technologies are better or worse too. I've certainly had my share of frustrations with LMSs, and I wish I could tell you why they're oftentimes so constraining or so frustrating, considering what we have to work with and what we can do with it, and thinking much more about the design process that we're engaging when we use the technology and what we want to create at the end of it helps us use it towards its best purposes. And maybe in some cases choose a different tool if we have a different tool. Again, like with this podcast, you're using Zencaster, which you mentioned has worked really well. Maybe if you tried a different tool, it wouldn't work as well. So it's often about that blend of considering goals, tools, affordances, constraints, and what we do and the design and the intention that we bring to what we create with the technology. So I think technologies can be incredibly powerful. If you think about all the things that we do that we couldn't do, they're absolutely critical for creativity. Without technologies, we would just be sitting here doing nothing beyond what's in our own head and what we could say. So they extend our thinking outside of our bodies and really create a lot of opportunity. They can be incredibly wonderful for opening up new creative possibilities, and they can also constrain it and shut it down based on how we interact with it and what the tools themselves have. That was kind of a long answer, rambling answer, but hopefully that gets to some of it.
Well, I know that you're an advocate of the use of technology in enhancing creativity, and I know that you're an expert in that. I remember that the first conversation we ever had, I looked it up. It was 2016, and you
Oh,
contacted
yeah.
me. You contacted me to
Yes.
interview me for your Tech Trends column. Then
Yeah.
to prepare for this podcast interview, I went on the website for the Tech Trends column, and it's about technology, right? But all the people that you interviewed are not all, but many of them are creativity researchers. So I can
Right.
tell that you think there is a potential in technology to enhance creativity.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, creativity is this process of creating something new. Like I was saying, if we didn't have technologies, whether you're thinking about technology in terms of the physical world, like a box of crayons, a set of paints, a ruler, whatever you're using to create something, or whether you think of technology in terms of the digital world, like podcast software or movie editing software, if we didn't have these tools, we wouldn't really be able to create the wide range of human expressions and products that we do create. So I see technology as being really essential and critical for creativity. It's part of what helps us kind of extend our ideas and what's in our head out into the world. It's very much dependent on though what we also bring to it. Like I said, the kind of goals that we have when we interact with technology and what we want to create with it and how we think about using it. So there's all kinds of potential for technology, any new technology, to really open up and expand creativity. We've seen that with things like YouTube and this sort of, in the last 20 plus years, the proliferation of digital cameras, and you can shoot it on your phone, and movie editing software and things and platforms on the internet like YouTube or others that allow people to share their work. There's this sort of opening up of creativity and a lot more people wanting to create content than there used to be. Doesn't mean that it's all great or that it's all creative. Technology allows us to make things possible that wouldn't be otherwise. And it sort of is also always there for opening up some new avenues. So I do see it as, I think of it in terms of cognitive tools, or tools that allow us to take our cognition, take our thoughts and ideas, and extend them outside of ourselves into the world. Whether you're just on a laptop writing a novel or a poem in a Word document, or whether you're shooting a video and putting a short movie on YouTube, whether you're doing a podcast. If you think about, technologies have been with us all along. Humans have always been finding new ways to use tools in the world around them to do new things, to solve problems, to create new things. It's just the digital world has kind of proliferated and opened up the possibilities for doing that and for sharing it and putting it out there in the rest of the world to find an audience.
I love this idea of technologies being cognitive tools, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely. Or the best technologies, anyway, are technologies that enhance our own thinking, that are tools to help us think better, to think more creatively. Well, we're getting to the end of our podcast, and I'd like to wrap up by asking you what sort of advice maybe you could give us, something specific for our listeners for the rest of the day or the rest of the week that you
sure.
think research might provide some advice for, something you could do in the next week that would enhance your creativity.
I think anything that you can do that allows you a new experience, a new perspective, can support creativity. So that can involve dabbling in a new hobby. So, for example, a couple years ago, I decided to take just a class through the local recreation center on painting. I really didn't have any experience with painting, but just the taking the step of signing up for a few classes, and it wasn't a big commitment, was incredible. It was incredibly perspective changing because I hadn't really engaged with painting and the arts in that way, and it allowed me to think, I think, to break frame in certain ways and to see certain connections between thinking in the arts and creative cognition, because you have to think about, as you're painting something, think about what's really there and what you're looking at in terms of what your mind sees and what you assume is there, and really think about things like color and light and shadows. And so I had some different insights that people who do a lot of art probably might find obvious, but for me, doing something different that I hadn't tried before, or at least engaging in a form of the arts that I hadn't tried before, not in any sort of expert way. It was a very simple, basic class, just a few classes, but it was incredible. So things like that, just trying out a new hobby. You can practice a little bit of empathy, not in the sense of just kind of feeling sympathy for somebody, but practice on some perspective taking. If you engage with somebody who seems a little cranky or have not such a great experience, try flipping the perspective and rewrite, what would that experience look like from the other person's view? What did they experience? What did they think of me? What was going on there? You can try little habits like just trying a new way home, having a new experience, meeting a new person. Anything that you can do to kind of expand your range of experiences in small ways, sometimes in big ways, is really good for creativity. Like I was saying before, that one thing that we know to reliably correlate with creativity is openness to experience, and having that kind of openness of mind and openness to trying new things and to exploring or dabbling in different areas is really useful for creativity. So think of as many little new ways, and it can start small with just one little thing today, a book on a topic you've never read about, or trying, signing up for an art class, trying a new path home, whatever you can do to kind of make a habit over time of exploring different kinds of experiences and ways of seeing the world is something that is going to be good for your creativity.
Well, thank you, Danah. That was excellent advice. It's consistent with all the research I'm familiar with as well. So, Professor Danah Henriksen, thank you so much for joining the podcast today, The Science of Creativity. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.
I really enjoyed today's conversation with Professor Danah Henriksen. I've known Danah for almost 10 years. It's always a pleasure to share ideas and to learn more about her thinking on important topics like teaching and learning for creativity and how we can use technology to enhance creativity. Our conversation was grounded in the latest creativity research, but it wasn't just a scientific conversation. Dr. Henriksen was able to explain these important research findings in ways that everyone can use to enhance their own creativity. You don't have to teach people how to be creative. Everyone is already creative. Instead of teaching people to be creative, the role of the creative teacher is to give students permission to realize the creativity that they already have. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.